Augustine, Philosopher and Saint. Lecture number 3. In the previous 2 lectures, we've been looking at the context of Augustine's life and thought, its historical and intellectual context. Now, in the next series of lectures, these 4 lectures, we will talk about Augustine's life, but we won't be leaving his thought behind because Augustine's life is very much about the life of thought. We'll be looking at his life, first of all, through the lens of the Confessions, his great spiritual autobiography, perhaps the first great spiritual autobiography of the Western tradition. He wrote it when he was 45 years old. He was a bishop, a formidable, authoritative figure, already one of the most imposing people to inhabit the Roman world. But he wrote it about a young man who was not nearly so formidable, not nearly so sure of himself, much more confused, wayward, wandering, far from home. So you have to always distinguish, when you read the Confessions, between Augustine the author, the formidable bishop, and Augustine the young man, young Augustine, I'll call him, who doesn't know his way, who believes things that Augustine the bishop thoroughly disapproves of, who is not always a Catholic, is sometimes a heretic. Right? The Bishop Augustine is the great Catholic teacher. Young Augustine is the wayward heretic. He's very wayward, and he has a reputation, actually, as having a wild and promiscuous youth, which is a reputation that I think is a bit overplayed. It's a little too superficial to interpret the Confessions as the story of Augustine's wild and wayward youth, because Augustine is really trying to talk about the wayward soul, not just one particularly bad youth who had a bad time and found his way home, but rather the waywardness of the soul, the human soul, on its road back to God, but now finding itself far from God and needing to find the way home. He's trying to tell the story not just of his own youth, but of all of our souls. And when we read the Confessions, we want to see our own souls in it. Or at least that's what Augustine wants us to do. He's doing his best to show you a picture of the soul which is really your own as well as his own. So, in these next 3 lectures, we will be looking at the Confessions from 3 different angles. First of all, this lecture will be looking at Augustine's Confessions from the what I'll call the intellectual angle. We'll be looking at his mind and its search for truth. The next lecture, lecture 4, we'll be looking at the emotional angle of the Confessions, his heart and its story of love and loss. And thirdly, in lecture 5, we'll look at the Confessions from the religious angle. We'll look at the soul and its road home. So we'll be looking at the intellectual, emotional, and religious angles, mind, heart, and soul. 3 different angles on the same thing, right? It's like looking at a house from 3 different perspectives. It's the same thing we're looking at, because you can't separate these things in Augustine, because mind, heart, and soul are actually 3 different names for the same thing. So don't think that we're talking about different things. We're looking at the same thing from 3 different angles. So when we look at the intellectual angle, what we need to look at is Augustine's life in philosophy, which begins when he's 19 and has an encounter with a book. It turns out that encounters with books play a crucial role in Augustine's life. But let's set a little context for this encounter with this important book. First of all, the context that we need to look at is the context of Roman Africa. Augustine grew up in Africa, which in the Roman world means the part of North Africa between Morocco and Egypt, not including Morocco and Egypt. It's a very limited part of what we now call Africa. Africa is the site of some of the oldest Christian communities in the Western world. Africa's Christian church is well-established, staunch, pious, rock-ribbed. You can think of Africa as the Bible Belt of the Roman Empire. It's a lot like the Midwest. It's not only the Bible Belt, it's the Corn Belt of the Roman Empire, because in Augustine's day, the Sahara Desert was not nearly as large as it is today, and much of the coastline from the Mediterranean into the hinterlands was very fertile. So Africa grew a lot of the grain for the Roman Empire. So that's another way that's a lot like the Roman Empire, right? Africa is not at the center of things in the Roman Empire. It's not where things are happening, right? Imagine Augustine growing up in Arkansas among fundamentalists. Later in his life, he's going to make it to the Big Apple. He's going to come to where people are sophisticated and really know how to think deep philosophical thoughts. But in Africa, he's among an authoritarian church which basically says, you believe what we teach you or else you're in trouble. And Augustine doesn't like this. His adolescence is shaped by his rebellion against that. So this rebellion begins with something promising, which then goes astray. The promising thing is that he encounters Cicero. Now, he encounters Cicero because of his peculiar education. Well, it's actually not peculiar. It's a very common form of education in the ancient world. He's being trained as a rhetorician, a public speaker. And it's hard to explain to a modern audience how immensely important public speaking was in the ancient world. Public speaking, eloquence, oratory, was a form of power. It was a way of convincing large numbers of people to see things your way. All of ancient political life required eloquence, required public speaking as a form of politics. So when you're being trained as a rhetorician, a public speaker, you're being trained for political power. And this is very important for Augustine because he's from the lower middle classes, right? He's from Arkansas, from a small town in Arkansas, from a small farm in Arkansas. He's actually from a small farm in Africa, not one of the great landed estates of the nobility, right? He's a small town guy. He's small time, but he's very, very smart, very, very smart, and he's good at eloquence. He speaks beautifully. So this rhetorical training is part of his ambition, worldly ambition, as the Bishop Augustine will say. He doesn't approve of this, Bishop Augustine doesn't, but he is being trained, young Augustine is, for political power, for worldly ambition, by learning how to speak well. And eloquence becomes, for the mature Augustine, the bishop, a kind of symbol of what goes wrong in human society. Deceitful words used as a form of power. That's his education. And that's all he knew, evidently, of the world of the intellect until, while he was reading a series of books by Cicero, the great Roman rhetorician, as part of his education, he came across an unusual book. Cicero not only wrote about rhetoric, he wrote about philosophy. He wrote a series of philosophical dialogues in his old age, and one of them was called the Hortensius. It was a dialogue designed to exhort you to philosophize, an exhortation to seek wisdom. Remember, philosophy means love of wisdom. So an exhortation to philosophize is an exhortation to seek wisdom. And that exhortation made all the difference in Augustine's life. Here he says in Confessions 3, he's describing what it was like to read that book. Here's Augustine. This book, in truth, changed my desires and turned my prayers to yourself, O Lord, and made me have other hopes and desires, other hopes than worldly ambition. Worthless suddenly became every vain hope to me, and with an incredible warmth of heart I yearned for the immortality of wisdom. I was delighted with that exhortation, but I didn't, here it is. I was stimulated and enkindled and inflamed to love, seek, obtain, hold, and embrace, not this or that philosophical school, but wisdom itself, whatever that is. And this alone was missing, was that the name of Christ was not there. He tells us the name of Christ was something he drank in with mother's milk. We'll hear more about that in the next lecture. But remember, he's raised as a Catholic in this Catholic community. He does care about the name of Christ, and Cicero is a pagan. He doesn't hear anything about Christ in Cicero, and yet he hears about something that inflames his heart and turns his desires to God, to the wisdom of God. What he doesn't know at the time, and which he will think is very important later, is that Christ is the wisdom of God, right? But at the moment, he doesn't know that. So his heart is inflamed with the desire for wisdom. He does turn to the Scriptures. He's 19 years old. He's been turned on to philosophy. He longs to find wisdom, and now he seeks it in the Scriptures, in the Bible. But it doesn't work, oddly enough. He turns to the Scriptures, and of course he finds the name of Christ, but he also finds a very badly written book. The Scriptures he read were an old Latin translation that was not very eloquent, not beautiful, powerful words like Cicero's, not very persuasive, not good, persuasive, powerful words like he was learning to speak as a rhetorician. They were humble and awkward, and Augustine was too proud to submit to the teachings of Scripture. So he left that behind. So here's this kind of progress he's making. He reads Cicero, and that turns him on to philosophy. He longs, and he's on fire for wisdom. And then he reads the Scriptures, and he's disappointed. Too humble. He's too proud. The Scriptures too humble for him. Then what happens is he comes to the Heretics, the third place he goes to. The Heretics are called Manichaeans. That's a particular heresy that he takes up with. They're sort of the opposite of the philosophers. The philosophers sought wisdom, whatever that was. Right? They knew something about the reality of wisdom, but they didn't know the name Christ. The Manichaeans were just the opposite. They knew the name of Christ. They were constantly talking about Christ and using his name, but they didn't know anything about the reality of Christ. In fact, they thought that Christ, the wisdom of God, was the moon. They literally identified the wisdom of God with the moon and said that that was Christ. He was also the sun, the power of God. And in any case, they identified God with visible light. Nice and pure, not very bodily, but still visible light. Right? So a Platonist would look at that and say, oh, that's not divine. That's just a part of the physical, or rather sensible world. So the Manichaeans, you see, were materialists. Right? That's something important to know about them. That's actually Augustine's chief complaint about the Manichaeans, is that for them the whole world was made up of visible or sensible stuff that takes up space, like a bodily thing. Now, the Manichaeans are also famous for another problem. They are not only materialists, but secondly, they are dualists. And that's what they're famous for. That's not the main complaint that Augustine makes about them. His main criticism is that they're materialists. But because they're materialists, their dualism is a real problem. Dualism means that the Manichaeans think that the world is divided into two kinds of things. There's the good stuff and the bad stuff. The good stuff is light, pure, clean, visible light, like the sun and the moon. The bad stuff is dark, heavy. It's the stuff your body is made of. It's dirty and slimy and foul. Right? They really hated the body. They thought it was very spiritual to hate the body. Right? We're familiar with that kind of spirituality even today, the kind of spirituality that is embarrassed about the body. Right? To understand the Manichaeans, you have to imagine that every time you think about your body, you think about its innards, its insides, that filthy, gooey stuff in your intestines and your bowels. Ugh! Right? But your soul is different. Your soul is made of the good stuff. It's pure light, trapped in this filthy prison. The soul itself is pure, untainted, but it's captive, taken captive, actually in a kind of great battle between the good stuff and the bad stuff. The good stuff was in one place in the universe, the bad stuff was in another place in the universe. The bad stuff, being kind of violent, attacked the good stuff and captured some of it. And we, or rather our souls, are captives in this prison of this filthy, vile body. But both body and soul, good stuff and bad stuff, is physical, or rather visible, material stuff that takes up space. And that's Augustine's chief complaint. But secondly, he does complain about the dualism, because the bad stuff, you see, has always been there. And God didn't make it. And God can't control it, really. And that's not Catholic doctrine. According to Catholic doctrine, God created all things, and he's in charge of all things. There's no such thing as an evil stuff that's always been there that God can't control. Now, third thing that Augustine complained about with the Manichaeans. They're materialists, they're dualists, and thirdly, they're rationalists. That is, the Manichaeans came into the Bible Belt, to Africa or Arkansas, And they said, we're much more spiritual than those Catholics. Right? You Catholics, you're stuck on bodily things. We believe in this dualist stuff where the good stuff is heavenly and light and so on. And also, you Catholics, you believe what your priests tell you. It's all based on faith. And you take what the priests tell you on faith as if they really knew. And they demand that you believe it and not think. But we, Manichaeans, we can prove what we're saying. Right? We rely on reason, not on faith. We can prove it. And Augustine was very attracted by that. It turns out later, of course, that Augustine believes that the Manichaeans did not really succeed in proving their point. But as a young man, as an adolescent in his 19, 20, 21 years old, he was very attracted by that. In fact, I think this is a major point of psychological attraction of Manichaeanism for Augustine. Because Augustine portrays himself in these years as, well, a snot-nosed kid, right? He is the smartest kid around, and he knows it. And he'll go to a Catholic priest, and he'll argue with him, and he'll win the argument. And he'll say, why should I believe what you say? I'm smarter than you are. I know better than you are. You can't prove anything to me. And of course, he's being trained in rhetoric, so he knows all about making clever arguments that show someone is wrong and arguing circles around people. And therefore, he's proved to himself that he's the smartest guy around, and unfortunately, he's probably right. Yeah? So the Manichaeans play into that egotism. And they play into his sense that he's more spiritual than these dumb Catholic priests who are just concerned about running a parish and getting enough money to run the parish and all that sort of, institutional, organized religion, all that sort of stuff. So he likes that. But something eventually changes, of course. He doesn't stay a heretic. What changes is that Augustine eventually hits the Big Apple. He leaves North Africa and goes to Italy. Part of his ambitions is he wants to get to where the action is. And Italy is where the action is in the Roman Empire, Rome, and especially Milan, it turns out. Because at that time, Milan was the residence of the emperor. The emperor was staying in Milan, not Rome. The bishop of Milan was one of the most important public figures in the Roman Empire. His name was Ambrose. Saint Ambrose, to you Catholics. He's bishop of Milan. And he's the smartest Catholic that Augustine has run into in his life. And what's more, he's surrounded by other smart Catholics. He's surrounded by the most sophisticated circle of Christian Platonists in the Latin world. So Milan is the Big Apple. It's the place where Augustine meets sophisticated Christians for the first time. He meets Platonist Christians for the first time. And that means he finds a more spiritual form of philosophy than Manichaeanism. Because the Manichaeans believed that visible light was God, right? The visible light was the good stuff, that's God. And our souls are a fragment of God, fragment of that visible light trapped in the body. So the soul is part of God, right? But it's still a visible, spatial, bodily sort of thing, like the light of the sun. The Platonists give Augustine a notion of non-bodily light, right? The light that lightens the mind's eye. Remember that from last lecture. The Platonists in Milan open his eyes to a whole new dimension of being, literally to a whole new world. That takes place in a great encounter that Augustine narrates in Book 7 of the Confessions. He sets it up by talking about a key intellectual problem. The intellectual problem that we discussed in the last lecture. How do you conceive of a non-bodily mode of being? Right? Augustine, young Augustine now, the young man, is convinced that if he can only figure out what it's like for something to have a non-bodily mode of being, then he will have finally gotten free of Manichaeanism. He's unconvinced by the Manichaeans, but he's not yet ready to be a Catholic, and what he needs is to understand this non-bodily mode of being, the spiritual nature of God. Here's how he sets up the problem. He wants to conceive of a non-bodily substance, right? Imagine a problem about omnipresence. That's the big problem for Augustine. God is present everywhere, omnipresent. But now, how is that possible? Is it like water in a sponge, right, which is everywhere in a sponge? God is spread out through the whole world like water in a sponge? But that doesn't really make sense, it turns out, because that would mean that, just like there's some of the water's over in one end of the sponge, and some of the water's over in the other end of the sponge, well, that would mean that part of God was over that part of the world, and part of God was over in that part of the world, and there's some of God over here in the lectern, and there's some of God over there in the desk, and that can't be right, right? God is everywhere, but he can't be spread out part by part, right? That's the spatial mode of being that bodies have. You know, here's part of my body over here, and another part of my body over there. They're in different places, but my body has a spatial mode of being, so it's divided part by part in space. But God can't be like that. He's non-bodily, and therefore he has a non-spatial mode of being. There's another problem. Right? Three problems, really. He wants to conceive of a non-bodily substance. He wants to understand God's omnipresence. And thirdly, he has to figure out where evil comes from. This is a great and famous question. Unde malum is the Latin. Whence evil? Where does it come from? It's a burning question because, you see, the Manichaeans have a good answer to that question. Evil started in this realm of darkness and foul, thick, disgusting stuff that's in one place in the universe, and the good stuff is in the other place of the universe. So the question, where does evil come from, had an actual literal answer. Evil came from that evil realm of bad stuff. Now, Augustine doesn't believe that anymore at the beginning of Book 7, but he needs some other way of figuring out where evil came from, right? God created the universe. There is no bad stuff independent of God. Well, then where did evil come from if God didn't create it? And if it's not already there, right? He's got a problem about that. In Book 7 of the Confessions, Augustine describes how this question just agonized him. It tore him apart. He sighed and groaned, and only God could hear the groans, the inward groans of his heart, longing for truth. And therefore, he was really ready when he finally encountered what he calls some books of the Platonists. Probably books by Plotinus and maybe Porphyry, pagan Platonists, who help him understand what this non-bodily mode of being might be like. And then in a marvelous and very, very important passage in the center of Book 7, chapter 10, section 16, he describes what it's like. Let me actually read that for you. He's read these books of the Platonists, and it's not just paganism that he sees. Because, you see, the books of the Platonists, once again, do something to his heart, and he turns the attention of his mind's eye in a different direction. In fact, let me back up and mention the key clue that he uses. Remember how one part of my body is over here, and the other part of my body is over there. Can't be like that with God, but it's like that with my body. But you know, there's another part of myself, right? The soul. My soul isn't spread out part by part. It doesn't have a bodily mode of being. It has a non-spatial mode of being. The soul isn't God, but it's a clue to the non-spatial, non-bodily mode of being that God has. So Augustine is going to turn to look at his soul as the great clue to the nature of God. That's what the books of the Platonists do for him. They help him look in this new direction at the soul. Because he points out, look, I was trying to perceive what a non-bodily substance would be like, and every time I tried it, I was imagining, something that I could see with my eyes. What I didn't do is look at the very act of imagining that my soul was doing. If I could look at what my soul was doing when it was imagining this spread out sort of God, then I would see something that wasn't spread out, that wasn't bodily, and that was the clue. Well, the books of the Platonists told him where to look. They didn't explain it to him. No book can show you how to see this non-bodily substance. Just like if you write down a proof of the Pythagorean theorem on the chalkboard, that's not going to show you the true eternal triangle. You have to see it with your mind's eye. So the books of the Platonists pointed him in the right direction. They admonished him to return to himself, he says. And being admonished to return to myself, I entered into my inmost self, he says. And you, God, were leading me on, for you had become my helper. So he made this inward turn with the help of God. It wasn't just him. It wasn't just philosophy. It was the grace of God that helped him turn inward. That's the first step. Step number one is an inward turn. But then there's another movement he has to make, because the soul, of course, is not God. Right? So looking at the soul is not the same thing as looking at God. He turns inward, enters into the inmost space of his self, and then does something else. He looks upward. He turns inward and looks upward. He moves in, then up. And from that inner space, deep within him, he looks up and he sees the eternal light, like Plato looking at the light of the sun in the allegory of the cave, which we'll mention later. He sees the eternal light shining above him, which isn't the light of the sun or the moon, isn't anything like that light. It isn't like the light that he had worshipped as a Manichaean, that visible light. It's a new kind of being. And that's the crucial thing that gives him a conception of what it's like to have a non-bodily substance. But it doesn't last very long. He sees that non-bodily light, and his eyes are dazzled. Right? The mind's eye is dazzled. It's too bright for him to understand because his mind's eye is impure. He can't keep gazing at it. And he falls back, defeated by the brightness and glory of that light. But for the rest of his life, he wants to get back to that vision, that moment of insight when he says, aha, now I see it. And he wants to get back to that. The rest of his life is a road back to that vision. But meanwhile, he has solved his intellectual problems. He has seen truth, capital T. Right? That light is the light of truth, capital T. And truth means God for Augustine. For Augustine, truth is God. And truth, Augustine says, is not spread out part by part. Truth is everywhere in the universe. Who could say that it wasn't? But it's not spread out part by part like my body, part of it here and part of it there. All of truth is present everywhere. All of truth is present here and there and everywhere. It's indivisible, it's non-spatial, it is the truth of the very being of things. And it is not divided up. It is present everywhere as a whole. It is totus ubique, is the technical Latin, everywhere as a whole. So that solves the problem about omnipresence. That solves the problem about understanding a non-bodily substance. And it helps him understand the problem about where evil comes from. For God created everything good. Augustine will literally say, all that is good. That's a quote from the Confessions, right? All that is good. And evil is not a form of being. It's not a form of stuff like in the Manichaean religion, right? It's not some stuff that takes up space in the world. Evil is a corruption of what is good. Evil is something going wrong in what's good. We're going to have to discuss this at greater length later, but let me give you a quick example. When something goes wrong with a shirt, it gets a hole in it, right? A tear, a rip. The hole, in a certain sense, doesn't exist. It's something missing, right? That's what evil is like in Augustine's universe. There's this good thing that God made, like a garment, and a hole in that garment has appeared, and that's evil. Something ripped and torn and broken and corrupted, something gone wrong. But the evil is not a positive being of its own. Like a hole, it's not its own form of being. It's real in a certain sense. There really is a hole in the shirt, right? There's really evil in the universe, but it's not a form of being. It's not like this bad stuff in the Manichaean universe. It's not a form of being, it's a form of non-being, of absence and lack. We'll have to talk about that at greater length in a later lecture. But the last thing to mention is that this Platonist vision was brief. He caught this glimpse, aha, I see it, this glimpse of eternal truth. But he had to fall back again with his eyes dazzled by the glory of it. He wasn't ready to understand. His eyes were not pure enough. This mind's eye was diseased by sin, not ready to see. And the rest of his life is getting back to that vision. And that's where philosophy is not enough, where Christianity and the church and all those external things that we talked about, that comes back in. The life that Augustine lives for the rest of his life is a road back to that vision, which you'll call the beatific vision, the vision that makes us happy. We have a long journey to go. It's the road that Jesus Christ took. It's the road that we take when we join the church. And only in the church are we going to be able to find the way back. The pagan philosophers also caught a glimpse of that eternal truth, but they were too proud to take the humble road laid by Scripture and Christ and church, and they couldn't find their way back home. Augustine is convinced that in the church, following the humility of Christ, we can find our way home. And that's where he ends up teaching for the rest of his life, teaching the road home in the life of the church, the body of Christ.